We have a truly distinguished guest today, a remarkable American to open the conference. Never dreaming at the time of scheduling this event that the Indians and the Red Sox would be throwing the first pitch at 4:07. However, there's not a damn thing we can do about it. And, however, I did call Julian and I said, Julian, I've been invited to that game. And I called his answering machine, and his wife, a great baseball fan, said, he'll understand when I tell him. So I will do my honors, and they are that, and introduce John Mack, who will introduce Julian Bond, and then Ann and I will creep into a cab and streak toward Fenway Park. And I will report back. Julian? Let me say this. I met this remarkable man, a special man with a special mission that he met, and met every test, when we both were elected to the state legislature at the same time. I in Wyoming in 1965, he in the Georgia legislature in 1965. However, they seated me. They did not seat Julian. They unseated him. And then he did it again, and they tried it again, and finally the U.S. Supreme Court took care of the business. That's the way it worked in 1965 and 67. So we met at several conferences, and we meet in airports. A wonderful man. But the conference is entitled A Seat at the Table, Fairness and Minority Representation. And the purpose of the conference is to generate informed discussion on issues of minority representation in elective politics, such as the relative absence of minority elected officials at levels beyond local governments, racially gerrymandered districts, and the notion of pigeonholing of minority candidates into stereotypical roles. And we welcome in particular the participants who came from colleges and universities throughout New England, including Dartmouth, Smith, Brown, Wellesley, and MIT. And I want to introduce John Mack, who is an Institute Fellow, Institute of Politics, President of the Los Angeles Urban League, 1969 to the present, member of the Los Angeles Education Alliance for Restructuring Now, and Los Angeles County Private Industry Council. He has a study group that is going to be very popular, just as he is. The Future of Urban America, Finding Solutions Through Strategic Partnerships and Policy Advocacy. That's Tuesdays from 4 to 5:30 each Tuesday during the study group time. And John Mack, I've come to thoroughly enjoy, a delightful man of warmth and wit and wisdom. And he and Julian did things that are beyond the comprehension of anyone young in this room at a time when it was exceedingly unpopular to do it, when it was thought that it would not work and they hoped it wouldn't. And they, with their sense of mission and goals and the willingness to work within the system, which was awfully tough for some to do at that time. And they both did, and they changed the face of America in more ways than one. So with that, John Mack and Julian, and I feel horrible, but God bless. Play ball. John, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Al. Coming from Los Angeles now, you know I'm a Dodger fan, so I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for you. but since I'll be here for the next 3 months or so, I'll see if I can't develop a little warmth in my heart for the Red Sox. So we'll say, go Sox. I'm really, really very honored and privileged to have been asked to participate in this session, first of all because of the importance of the conference itself. And I would like to join Al Simpson in welcoming each of you and thanking you so very much on behalf of of the students who have planned this conference. I think it's going to be very stimulating and very, and I know it's important. And of course, we're going to start it off with a bang. I had not planned to commercialize, but I do thank our IOP director, Al Simpson, for plugging my study group, which will be held on Tuesdays. I do want to just get a little special commercial in. We're going to begin, though, this coming Wednesday at 4 o'clock. And we're very pleased that Hugh Price, president of the National Urban League, will be our featured guest on that occasion. So I'd like to invite you to come and join us. It is a real thrill for me to introduce our speaker for this occasion, Julian Bond. Julian Bond is I was about to say old friend, but we're both youngsters who've just known each other for a long time. We go back to the Atlanta student civil rights movement days, both having participated in the activities back in the early 1960s. As we all know, Julian Bond is currently the chairman of the board of the NAACP, and under his leadership in partnership with Kwesi Mfumu, they have really re-energized the NAACP into a very vibrant and dynamic civil rights organization which has a great history in America and which clearly has been in the forefront of the civil rights struggle and clearly has made a lasting impact in so many different ways. When he's not in an airplane, as we were chatting before coming out, doing volunteer work for the NAACP, Julian is a lecturer in history at the University of Virginia. He's a distinguished professor at the American University. His credits go on and on. As has been indicated, he is from Atlanta. He's a Morehouse man, an institution with great tradition. Some of you maybe in the audience can relate to that. Morehouse would like to see itself as the Harvard of the South, or at least of Atlanta anyway. But it clearly is an outstanding institution and has produced great leaders. Julian was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives in 1965. He became nationally known for his stand against the Vietnam War early in his career. He was unelected because of his stand, his courageous stand. He was re-elected, unseated, but he and his constituents stayed the course. Julian Bond has written extensively. He has narrated very important documentaries, such as A Time for Justice and the prize-winning and critically acclaimed series, Eye on the Prize. It is my pleasure and honor to present to you Julian Bond, Chairman of the Board of NAACP.
Thank you. Thank you a great deal, John. It's, as always, a great pleasure to be here. I appreciate the kind things that you have said about me, but you got something wrong. This institution for years has been known as the Morehouse of the North. And it's just a big thrill for me to be here. Senator Simpson is right that John Mack and I were engaged in the 1960s student movement, student part of the movement for civil rights in Atlanta. He was one of the leaders at Atlanta University of a group which integrated Atlanta's lunch counters and movie theaters and really began the process of changing the face of that city. It's always a great pleasure to see him and a pleasure to see Senator Simpson. It is true, I am married to probably the world's biggest sports fan. I couldn't honestly care less and don't really know who's playing whom or what the big deal is. I've never understood it, but she told me that had she been in his place, she would have gone too. I can't help but mention before I begin the passing on Monday of Lewis Redding. He's a 1928 graduate of the law school here. For 20 years, the only black lawyer in the state of Delaware. lawyer for the NAACP who fought hard to make sure that everyone had a seat at the table. He was 96 years old, and he will be severely missed. Now, in 1965, President Johnson spoke to Congress about new civil rights protections he was proposing. He said then, "The harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes." And then he situated the problem in entrenched white supremacy. "For the fact," he said, "is the only way to pass these barriers is to have a white skin. Experience has clearly shown that the existing processes of law cannot overcome systematic and ingenious discrimination." Well, just a week before Johnson spoke, state troopers in Alabama had beaten peaceful demonstrators at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. The national outrage at Bloody Sunday met Johnson's months-old plans to ensure black Southerners could finally vote. Within a few months, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became law. It is generally agreed to be the most effective civil rights legislation ever passed. Before it became law, blacks in the southern states were victims of a century-old system of legally sanctioned white supremacy, enforced by private and state terror, including ritual human sacrifice. In all but a few instances, blacks were excluded from voting and had no influence in the conduct of public affairs. Within the first 2 years following passage of the act, the percentage of blacks registered to vote in my former home state of Georgia almost doubled. While the numbers of black voters increased dramatically after passage of the act, the resistant white South's ingenious efforts to dilute black votes and to frustrate black power prompted renewal of the act in 1970, again in 1975, and for a last time in 1982. The 1982 amendments were the result of congressional acknowledgement of a hard truth. The simple ability to cast a vote did not provide the newly enfranchised blacks with a realistic opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. The resistant white South had responded to the threat posed by an expanded electorate by changing election methods so black votes were diluted. And they extended their ancient repugnance to black people to the ballot box, refusing then and now to vote for black candidates. On the 30th anniversary of the Act's passage, a group of demonstrators retraced the steps of the original marchers from Selma to Montgomery. In Montgomery, the governor who commanded the state troopers met them and prayed with them and apologized for his words and deeds of 3 decades earlier. "May your message be heard," he said. "May your lessons never be forgotten. May our history always be remembered." Well, George Wallace may not have forgotten, but the history he spoke of and its legacy today is all too often disregarded by others. Modern examples of this historical neglect are easily seen in the seemingly unending attacks on black voting rights, more than 3 decades after the Selma to Montgomery March, more than 3 decades after Johnson's speech, and more than 3 decades after the Voting Rights Act became law. These attacks are not confined to voting rights. Another favorite target is affirmative action. The attackers are all the same people, and the arguments they advance against both the Voting Rights Act and affirmative action are fundamentally the same. Their underlying thesis is that race-conscious efforts, such as the Voting Rights Act or affirmative action, contradict the colorblind society in which we live. Reality contradicts this thesis. Racial discrimination and its effects, gross racial disparities, are alive and well today. Those who argue otherwise are blind, all right, blind to the consequences of being the wrong color in America today. Or as Justice Stevens put it with more eloquence, there is no moral or constitutional equivalence between a policy that is designed to perpetuate a caste system and one that seeks to eradicate racial subordination. Justice Ruth Ginsburg emphasized the persistence of racial inequality and the need to act affirmatively, not only to end discrimination, but also to counteract discrimination's lingering effects. A short time ago, the newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, tried to rid the word ghetto from its lexicon but we've hardly eliminated the ghetto from our reality. Its foundation is institutionalized white supremacy in the real estate and banking industries. Its pilings are individual prejudice and discrimination. And its co-builder was the United States itself. From the FHA and its predecessor agency, where discrimination in home lending originated, to subsidizing the creation of the white suburbs through mortgage interest deductions and credit denial in inner cities, from the promotion of white flight by highway placement, to the use of urban renewal and public housing to isolate and contain blacks. The latest census tells us that 30% of the nation's black population still live in near total segregation, more than 9 million living in neighborhoods that are at least 90% black. Compared with poor whites, poor blacks live in neighborhoods where a high percentage of the residents are poor. They interact mainly with others who are poor, who share their disadvantage. They live squeezed together in less than standard housing, in neighborhoods denuded of essential services. They shop at stores owned by merchants geared to do business with a poor clientele. Their neighborhoods are economically segregated, bereft of opportunity, out of sight, and out of mind. Their children attend schools only with other poor children. They face, through no fault of their own, a life of poverty and isolation most of us cannot begin to understand and appreciate. And beyond the physical circumstances and the geographical barriers which circumscribe and describe their lives, they live within a larger society which views them as less than equal human beings, unworthy and unfit to be neighbor or to share common citizenship. In America today, compared with a white child, a black child is 1.5 times more likely to grow up in a family whose head did not finish high school, 2 times as likely to be born to a teenage mother, 2.5 times more likely to be born at low birth weight, 3 times as likely to live in a single-parent home, 4 times as likely to have a mother who had no prenatal care, 4.5 times more likely to live with neither parent, 5 times as likely to depend solely on a mother's earnings, and 9 times as likely to be a victim of homicide as a teenager or a young adult, the end of a long, winding uphill struggle to beat the racial odds against success. And when that child plays by the rules, stays in school, graduates, he or she will not earn on an equal level with whites. This may not be good news for those of you attending this university, but today the incomes of black families, in which one family member has a postgraduate degree, are lower on average than the incomes of white families in which the highest level of education achieved is graduation from elementary school. Well, whether one holds a PhD or an elementary school certificate, it's black skin, not yellowed parchment, that sets life chances. 100 years ago, black Americans faced prospects eerily similar to those we face today. Then it was 30 years after Civil War and the first Reconstruction. The 19th century was winding down, and white Americans grew weary of worrying about the welfare of the newly freed slaves, tired of fighting to secure their right to vote and to attend a public school. Then, as now, scientific racism and social Darwinism were in vogue. Then, and now, a race-weary nation decided these problems could best be solved if left to the individual states. And then, as now, the highest court in the land refused the judicial protection that ought to be accorded to a minority in a democracy, and ignoring reality, declared instead, when a man has emerged from slavery and has shaken off the inseparable concomitant of that state, there must be some stage in the progress of his elevation when he takes the rank of mere citizen and ceases to be the special favorite of the laws. More than 100 years after that Supreme Court announcement, no one can convincingly argue that black Americans have shaken off the inseparable concomitant of slavery. In the years since that utopian declaration, we've seen just one generation of integrated college campuses, the only such generation in our nation's history. That novel and radical change in American higher education, and similar changes elsewhere, occurred only because a nonviolent army, emboldened by the end of legalized segregation, arose to challenge segregation's morality as well. Army is an apt description of this cadre of women and men because they were literally at war, and as in war, suffered many casualties. But they also won many battles, and eventually, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that army finally won the war. As the nation emerged from the battlefield and the decades of oppression which preceded it, it understood, notwithstanding the Supreme Court pronouncement of 1863, that the black man deserved to be the special favorite of the laws. Only in this way could the cycle of disadvantage and discrimination be ended. Only in this way could we reduce inequality in income, housing, employment, education, life chances between blacks and whites. As Martin Luther King wrote in his last book in 1967, a society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for him. Thus were born the Voting Rights Act and affirmative action, the just spoils of a righteous and virtuous war. How, we must ask ourselves, were yesterday's civil rights victories transformed into today's civil rights violations? First, the growing number of blacks and other minorities and women pushing for entry into and power in the academy, business, government, other traditionally white male institutions created a backlash in the discourse over race. The previously privileged majority exploded in angry resentment at having to share space with the formerly excluded. Opinion leaders began to reformulate and redefine the terms of the discussion. Any indictment of white America could be abandoned. Instead, black behavior, not white racism, became the reason why blacks and whites lived in separate worlds. The burden of solving racial problems shifted from racism's creators to its victims. The failure of the lesser breeds to enjoy society's fruits became their fault alone. In a kind of nonsensical tautology, we heard again and again, oh, those people are poor because they're pathological. They're pathological because they're poor. Thus, pressure for additional civil rights laws became special pleading. America's most privileged population, white men, reimagined themselves as a victim class. Aggressive blacks and pushy women were responsible for America's demise. Now, all this occurred despite almost daily incidents of racial attack and a series of public opinion polls that reveal most Americans think minorities are less than equal human beings, lacking in thrift, morality, industriousness, and patriotism. Now, this blame shifting and role reversal, where victim becomes the perpetrator, where the minority becomes the majority, occurred as a result of an organized campaign which continues until this day. It is led by a curious mix of whites and some blacks, academics, journalists, and policymakers. It uses its arguments to legitimize reactionary and punitive social policy. Its supporters express strong support for equal rights, while they oppose every tool designed to achieve that goal. They attack and discredit affirmative action and fair reapportionment, not only because they serve as handy symbols of much despised government intervention, but also because they threatened ancient white-skin privilege. Let me tell you what they say. It's the fourth quarter of a football game between the white team and the black team. The white team is ahead 145-3. They've been cheating since the game began. They own the field, the uniforms, the referees, and the ball. There are 3 minutes left to play. Suddenly, the white quarterback, who feels badly about things that happened before he enters the game, turns to the black team and says, "Hey, fellas, can't we just play fair?" Of course, in the doublespeak used by these enemies of justice, fair never means fair. Current attacks against black political power threaten democracy as much as yesterday's stormtroopers that bloody Sunday in Alabama. What follows is an account of my experiences with voting rights litigation and the Voting Rights Act, as beneficiary of the Act's provisions, and as intervener and plaintiff, as one of many who have used the Act to advance civil rights for all. I hope my story reinforces the need to guard against the resurgence of white supremacy at the ballot box. From 1960 until the fall of 1965, I worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I want to discuss first my own experiences with the larger struggle of the right to cast a ballot, and a connected but equally important right to have that ballot counted in a meaningful way. The year following passage of the Voting Rights Act, I was plaintiff in a case which reached the United States Supreme Court and strongly reinforced the right to vote. The case was Bond v. Floyd, and it grew from my first election in 1965 to the Georgia House of Representatives, part of a group who comprised the first blacks in the lower house since Reconstruction. A series of federal lawsuits had reapportioned the Georgia General Assembly, overturning a system where cows and horses were better represented than human beings. The courts ordered new equal districts created in urban Fulton County and ordered elections for a one-year term. As a successful candidate for one of those seats, I was to take the oath of office on January 10th, 1966. 7 days before I was to take office, Samuel Young, Jr., a Tuskegee Institute student and SNCC worker, was shot and killed while trying to use the segregated bathroom at a Tuskegee service station. Now, Sammy was a Navy veteran. The irony of losing the life he had offered his country over a segregated toilet prompted the release of an anti-war statement by SNCC. On January 6, 1966, we became the first national civil rights organization to link the prosecution of the Vietnam War with the persecution of blacks at home. The statement accused the United States of deception in its claims of concern for the freedom of colored peoples in such countries as the Dominican Republic, the Congo, South Africa, Rhodesia, and in the United States itself. The United States is no respecter of persons or laws, the statement said, when such persons or laws run counter to its needs and desires. The statement created a sensation. In the civil rights community, it created a breach in the relationship between the most militant organizations and the administration of President Lyndon Johnson, and it further widened the gap between SNCC and the civil rights mainstream. The reaction in the white South was even more severe, including harsh criticism from Southern white liberals, like Ralph McGill and Lillian Smith, whose anti-communism competed with their commitment to equal rights for blacks. I was the communications director of SNCC, and when I appeared to take the oath of office on January 10th of '66, hostility from white legislators was palpable and nearly absolute. They prevented me from taking the oath. They declared my seat vacant, and they ordered another election to fill the vacancy. I won that election, and I was expelled again. By the time I approached a third election, this time for a 2-year term, I had filed suit in federal court. Federal Judge Griffin Bell wrote the majority decision for the 3-judge court, which refused to overturn the legislature's decision to deny me the seat I had already won twice. His decision was overruled by a unanimous Supreme Court, and a year after my first election, I became a member of the Georgia House of Representatives. Now, I'd never been to the Supreme Court. As I sat and listened to Georgia's Attorney General argue that Georgia had a right to refuse me, I found myself hypnotically nodding in agreement. My lawyer, Victor Rabinowitz, elbowed me sharply and whispered, "Stop that." But during Bolton's argument, the justices asked a few questions, and Justice Byron White leaned forward and asked, "Is that all you have? You've come all this way and that's all you have?" And I turned to Rabinowitz, I said, "We're winning, aren't we?" He said, "You bet we are." Well, we did win. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the decision, and his decision is more than a victory for the narrow First Amendment. It was a voting rights victory, a reaffirmation of my constituents' rights to free choice in casting their votes. Now, I ran afoul of Judge Bell once again in 1971. Once again, the unfettered right to vote was at issue, and once again, Judge Bell ruled against me. In a case called Bond v. Fortson, Andrew Young and I challenged Georgia's runoff primary vote provision for members of Congress. Judge Bell granted summary judgment to the defendants on the ground that the issue was not ripe for review, since neither Young nor I knew if we would ever run for Congress. Finally, I was party to a suit in 1981, in which the Voting Rights Act's protections were invoked to help create a majority black congressional district in Georgia. The case, Busby v. Smith, stands as an important landmark in voting rights litigation. In Busby, the court found impermissible racial intent in a voting rights case, requiring creation of a majority black district for the first time. The case grew from my attempts to create a majority black congressional district in Georgia. Georgia's 5th congressional district, encompassing Fulton County and most of Atlanta, was 50% black according to the 1980 census. Andrew Young had been elected to the Congress from Georgia's 5th in what voting rights lawyer Lachlan McDonald called the biracial afterglow of the civil rights movement in 1972. He served there until he was appointed United Nations ambassador by President Jimmy Carter in 1977. The 5th district from which he was elected was drawn only after the Attorney General had imposed a Section 5 objection to pre-clearance of the 1970 reapportionment plan drawn by the Georgia General Assembly. That plan had fragmented concentrations of black persons and had placed the residences of potential black candidates outside and the residences of potential white candidates inside the 5th District. For example, the homes of Andrew Young and Maynard Jackson were placed one block outside the boundary of the 5th. Then, in a special 1981 session of the Georgia General Assembly, called to consider reapportionment of legislative and congressional districts, I made several attempts to introduce and pass a reapportionment plan which would create a majority black congressional district. My white colleagues in the House and Senate also introduced a variety of plans. In each one of the plans they submitted, the 5th Congressional District followed the lines drawn in 1971. The black population percentage in the 5th never rose above 52%. Then in August, the House Reapportionment Committee adopted a plan which gave the 5th a population of 51% black. 5 days later in the Senate, I introduced in the Reapportionment Committee a plan which would have created a 73% black congressional district. I had waited until the disputes involving 8 of Georgia's 10 congressional districts were resolved. Those 8, districts 1 through 3 and 6 through 10, surrounded Fulton and DeKalb counties, creating a predominantly white donut around 2 heavily black counties. The hole in that donut would be my playground and battlefield. After the Bond plan was introduced, the chairman of the committee adjourned without seeking a vote. The next day, the committee adopted a plan which included my plan. The chairman cast the sole vote against it in violation of Senate rules. On the floor of the Senate, the chairman of the committee, at the urging of Lieutenant Governor Zell Miller, introduced an amendment to the committee plan. The chairman's amendment accomplished 2 tasks. It split prosperous Gwinnett County between 2 districts, so the county would not overshadow the 9th or the mountain district where the lieutenant governor lived, and it drew a 5th district with a 55% black population. I moved to amend the chairman's plan, creating a 5th district that was 69% black. My amendment was adopted. The Senate adopted a final plan encompassing my amendment, and the entire plan was sent back to the House for consideration. After the House adopted a plan which created a 51% black district, which was rejected by the Senate, conference committees were appointed. After 5 of them failed to reach agreement, finally the General Assembly agreed to a plan with a 57% black population majority in the 5th District. Now, I knew that a 57% black population majority meant a 47% black voting minority. Because blacks on the whole are younger than whites, equal numbers of blacks and whites will not produce equal numbers in both races old enough to vote. I knew too, and subsequently proved in court, that voting in Atlanta had become more, not less, racially polarized in the years since Andrew Young had been elected to Congress. The election of a black mayor, Maynard Jackson, in 1972 had decreased the possibility that white voters would cast their votes across the color line. Atlanta's first taste of black power had reinforced the racial tribalism of many white voters, solidifying their tendency to block vote. With the assistance of Georgia's Republican U.S. Senator Mac Mattingly, I sought a meeting with William Bradford Reynolds, the Reagan administration's Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. When Senator Mattingly was unable to arrange such a meeting, I turned to State Senator Paul Coverdell, the minority leader of the Senate. He set up the meeting with Reynolds, and Coverdell and I flew to Washington. Reynolds received us graciously, heard our arguments, imposed a Section 5 objection against the Georgia plan. Georgia sought a declaratory judgment against his decision in the Federal District Court in Washington. With a number of other legislators, I intervened, and the case of Busby v. Smith was joined. Now, during the legislative debate, and in the court fight which followed, the proponents of a majority black 5th district were abused and scorned. An Atlanta Constitution editorial accused me of creating a ghetto district whose representative would be ineffective. Senator Paul Coverdell was shown in a cartoon in a graveyard, digging up segregation's coffin. Coverdell and legislative Republicans were accused of trying to move blacks from the 4th into the 5th solidifying the already Democratic strength of the 5th while increasing Republican hopes in the 4th. And of course, Republicans then and now were willing to help black legislators, all Democrats, create a blacker 5th, and we blacks were eager to accept whatever assistance was offered, and almost none was forthcoming from the members of our own party. After trial, the district court concluded that the 5th Congressional District was drawn to suppress black voting strength in Georgia. Now, the arguments against my plan in the Georgia legislature and the trial testimony in Busbee are richly illustrative of the congressional arguments which would rage over amending Section 2 a year later in 1982. The Busbee arguments are predictive as well of arguments used today to discredit the act and to limit its effectiveness in enfranchising and empowering minority voters. Those arguments lost in Busbee, they deserve to lose today. The Busbee plaintiffs, including the governor, lieutenant governor, House Speaker, and the leadership of the House and Senate, made these arguments: that creating majority black voting districts perpetuates racial polarization in voting behavior, that relying on the courts supplants the normal methods of political process, coalition building, voter registration, and voting, that using race-conscious remedies is alien to the American political process, and that the Voting Rights Act demanded no more than a level playing field for racial minorities. Creating an opportunity to elect a black candidate was not required. In fact, racial prejudice and racial prejudice alone motivated the defenders of the final plan. The court found the following: Lieutenant Governor Zell Miller believed strongly in keeping white, rural, mountain voters in a cohesive district. Keeping black urban voters in a cohesive district was not. The goals of maintaining historical borders, preserving county and city lines, avoiding a Republican 4th district, all these were pretexts for discrimination. And House Reapportionment Chairman Joe Mack Wilson was a racist who objected to drawing what he called a nigger district. "I ain't drawing no nigger district," he said. And Lieutenant Governor Miller's objection to the Bond plan for allegedly creating a Republican 4th district was suspect. Neither Miller nor any other senator expressed any fear of Republican domination of the 4th. Miller, in fact, approved a reapportionment plan which preserved the 6th district represented by Representative Newt Gingrich and supported placing a portion of heavily Republican Gwinnett County in the 4th district. Because the evidence of racially discriminatory intent was so overwhelming, the court denied Georgia the preclearance that it sought. Until 1980, the standard for challenging discriminatory election procedures was set by a case called White v. Register. In White, the Supreme Court held that the 14th Amendment prohibits methods of election that deny minority voters an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and elect legislators of their choice. White was undermined in 1980 when the Supreme Court, in a case called the City of Mobile versus Bolden, reinterpreted the 14th Amendment standard to require proof of discriminatory intent. In '82, Congress amended Section 2 of the Act to restore the White standard. Section 2 now prohibits any voting law or practice which results in discrimination, regardless of its intent. Today, the Act faces attacks similar to those raised by Busbee years and years ago. Today's neo-segregationists argue that majority black districts set impermissible quotas for minority office holders and guarantee proportional representation, despite a prohibition against quotas in the Act. They argue that majority black districts resegregate, creating racial polarization in the electorate, a criticism majority white districts have never engendered. In fact, the nation's congressional districts were habitually segregated until well after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Nearly every district in the country and every district in the South was majority white. Black voters existed only as a political entity, as a cushion to ensure the election of white Democrats. Rather than promoting racially polarized voting, black districts serve as antidotes to ingrained habits of white bloc voting, which have routinely prevented racial minorities from winning public office. Before minority districts were created, no southern state had elected a black person to Congress in the 20th century. These neo-segregationists argue that the odd shape of minority districts makes them unconstitutional on their face.
They argue that race has vanished as a consideration in American political life, despite all evidence to the contrary. Now, this shape argument, the challenge to black districts on the grounds that their sometimes bizarre configuration makes them unconstitutional, perversely turns history on its head. It suggests that when and only when color and contour intersect, the Constitution is insulted. In Shaw versus Reno, the Supreme Court not only set this dangerous precedent, but in this and subsequent cases, they also adopted a special set of rules and standards, amounting to an elaborate system of affirmative action for whites, which will allow white voters to reassert their control of the political process. The court codified white privilege, just as the Voting Rights Act had begun to chip it away. Among the new rules for white voters brought to us by the court is the liberalization of standing, or who may bring a federal court case. White plaintiffs have been granted standing in redistricting cases because they allege they were being stereotyped or stigmatized by racial classification, precisely the kind of injury the court previously had rejected. The court also discovered a brand new constitutional right heretofore unknown, a right enabling white voters in North Carolina to challenge a congressional district based on its odd and irregular shapes. Prior to Shaw v. Reno, the court had held that the Constitution did not require compactness. Suddenly, shape became suspect. What the court has done is create a constitutional right for whites not to be represented by a black person. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had begun to level the playing field for America's racial minorities. It would be foolish to imagine that the passage of just 3 decades has lifted the heavy hand of white supremacy from any aspect of American life. Critics claim that race-conscious districting diminishes democracy, but as Professor Lonnie Guinier has written, in a society as deeply cleaved by issues of racial identity as ours, there is no one race. In the presence of racial differences, a system of representation that fails to provide group representation loses legitimacy. Well, how does my story end? Georgia subsequently passed a reapportionment plan the Justice Department felt met their pre-clearance standards. In elections in the 4th and 5th districts held a month later than the general election elsewhere in Georgia, Wyche Fowler was reelected to the House from the 5th. Representative Elliott Levitas was reelected from the 4th. Fowler was elected to the United States Senate in 1986, defeating incumbent Mattingly. Fowler is now the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. I became the first candidate in 1986 to announce for the 5th district seat, but lost in a primary runoff to Atlanta City Council member John Lewis, who holds the seat today. Judge Bell became Attorney General in the Carter administration. I had the great opportunity to testify against his nomination, and he took that occasion to apologize to me for writing the decision which kept me out of office for a year. Maynard Jackson, who saw the legislature in 1970, set the district line 1 block past his house, served as mayor of Atlanta from 72 to 1980. In November 1989, he was elected mayor again. He succeeded Andrew Young, who served from 81 till 90, and who was a candidate for governor in Georgia's 1990 Democratic primary. One of his opponents was Lieutenant Governor Zell Miller, who won that election and is governor of Georgia today. State Senator Paul Coverdale was named director of the Peace Corps by President George Bush and was elected to the U.S. Senate, defeating Wyche Fowler in 1992. And I have become a history teacher. Today's racist, however sophisticated their tools or their arguments, will use the same methods to divide and dilute black votes tomorrow they used for years and years before. There are lessons to be drawn from my experience in Georgia and the experiences of countless others who have tried to make equal rights a reality in modern America. One lesson is that racists, whether they are wool hat boys from below Georgia's gnat line, sophisticates at elite colleges who use their scholarship in service to a reactionary agenda, or the black-faced right-wing accomplices to social genocide, will employ any argument to oppose racial progress. They may be as crude as Joe Mack Wilson in his opposition to nigger districts, as clever as an academic in her manipulation of fact and misquotation of the record, as self-hating and shameless as African-American apologists for domestic apartheid. who favor race-neutral laws and a race-conscious society. Their racist intent and racist result are the same. Black Americans fought and died to force their way into the political process and to erect an effective federal apparatus to protect their continued participation in it. No American, black, brown, or white, can afford to have that right destroyed or its protections relaxed. Our democracy depends on it. Thank you.
Now, Julian, tell us what you really think. Thank you so very much for that very, very dynamic, instructive, enlightening, and stimulating address. And now it's your turn. You have an opportunity to raise questions, and I would just strongly suggest that we make them questions, brief statements, not a second keynote address.
Nice to see you. It's been 16 years. I think the last time we met was the Admiral Benbow.
Oh, I'm sorry. Pardon me. Would you please, there's a microphone to the left or right, and please use the microphone.
Hello. Right. It's been a long time. I used to work for Bill Thomas in OCR for many years and lived in Malden and Ponce de Leon for many years. And we ended up in '82 voting for the Reverend Jackson. I think it was in a runoff with Wyche Fowler. But all the people you mentioned bring back a long time ago that we were in Georgia, and it was very nice. The question I have to ask is a touchy one, perhaps. And how do you view as oh, and by the way, you're not just a history teacher, and that's just fine to be a history teacher. You're a maker of history.
Oh, well, it's kind of you. Thank you.
How do you view the arrival over the last 10, 15, 20 years of new immigrants into the United States vis-a-vis the affirmative action movement in the United States for African Americans?
Well, I welcome immigration into this country. I think newcomers give us life and vitality, bring us skills, vary our culture, offer us so much that we make a big mistake if we close our doors to them. We ought to be welcoming and opening to them, and I think for the most part, we generally tend to be. There are inevitable clashes over culture and religion and newness and unaccustomed to our ways of doing things, but it's something I've, speaking for myself, welcome and embrace and think a welcome part of modern-day American society.
Mr. Bond, one of the concerns of civil rights leaders is that there's a lack of youth participation in the current movement. What is the NAACP doing to solicit that participation?
You know, this is the most often asked question I get. And I find it peculiar because we have more youth members in the NAACP than any other secular organization in America that has both adult and youth members. Having said that, we have nearly not enough adult or youth members, and I surely wish we had more. We have 350 high school and college chapters made up of young people. There are 7 seats reserved on my board of directors for young people. I serve at the pleasure of 7 bright young people from college campuses all over this country. We have many, many young people in the NAACP, but we're not satisfied with the numbers we have, and we'd like to have more. And we're reaching out to them. I'm going to meet with a group of young people here who'd like to reestablish a NAACP chapter here. I don't know how many of you know Dr. Walter Carrington, who's visiting at the Du Bois Center. Dr. Carrington was the first president of an NAACP chapter at Harvard University when he was a student here, and Harvard would not let him call it the NAACP. They had to call it something like the Committee on Negro Business or stuff like that. And he was followed in, and Walter Carrington became the first youth member of the NAACP board. So I look forward to meeting with these young people who want to reestablish this venerable organization here on the campus.
Pardon me. We also have people in microphones on the second level. Yes. Are you? Yes.
Hi. It's significant that it took 100 years after the Civil War, which first raised, the promise of black freedom, for the Voting Rights Act to pass. During the civil rights movement, thousands of people, black and white, put their lives on the line for this very basic right for blacks. So if you look around today, I mean, you might ask, well, what happened? I mean, why, with few exceptions, are blacks still segregated at the bottom of American society? Why is Mumia Abu-Jamal on death row? I'm a member of the Spartacus League, a Marxist organization, and we note that the civil rights movement hit a dead end when it came north, where it became clear that the brutal exploitation and oppression of blacks was not simply a matter of laws against blacks. Black oppression is rooted in racist American capitalism. Those who today, as then, want to fight against racism have to reject the twin parties of American capitalism, the Republicans and the Democrats. Malcolm X called them the Dixiecrats. It's the power of the working class, led by a revolutionary party that can put an end to the system of brutal exploitation and oppression. We say, finish the Civil War for black liberation through socialist revolution. If you're interested in that perspective, you can check out some of our literature outside.
Thank you.
Oh, you did not have a question?
Why
Yes.
are blacks still segregated at the bottom of society?
Yes, sir.
My name is Kamal Latham. One of the graduate students here at the Kennedy School is very interested, along with some others, in starting that new fight to get the NAACP here at Harvard. And I had a question to that effect in terms of young people. In recent years, a lot of young people have looked at, in terms of maybe the next phase of the civil rights movement being the economic rights movement. And you see a lot of young people make advances to get on Wall Street. Recently, Jesse Jackson had a big movement called the Wall Street Project this past January, where he said that the next part of the civil rights movement should be focusing on economic rights. I want you to know, in terms of the future of the NAACP, how we focus on that and give that equal weighting or balance with the civil rights agenda.
Well, although some of the rhetoric may be new, I don't think the concentration is new. In my course at the University of Virginia, I'm just going through the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and the boycotters have 3 demands, and one of the demands is that black people ought to be allowed to be drivers of the bus, ought to have jobs. The movement for civil rights has always had a jobs agenda. The March on Washington 1963 was a march for jobs and freedom, not just for abstract freedom alone. Now that the nation is entrepreneurial crazy, the civil rights movement has followed in almost to a fault, I think. This is my personal opinion, not the NAACP's opinion, and has spent so much time enriching this small class of people that we've neglected the serious problems of working class black people. But the NAACP last year put out a report card on the hotel industry, arguing not only was this industry seriously lacking in employment, but in vendor and business opportunities for minority entrepreneurs to service these hotels, to take care of their external needs that they can't do. And we just issued a similar kind of report on the telecommunications industry and reported that, as you might expect, this industry also doesn't come up to snuff, both in its internal employment, particularly the further up the ladder you go, and in its vendor and business and contracting arrangements. So we very much feel that this is a frontier that we've not only met, but got to get past, that it's part and parcel of the work we do. You know, I keep getting asked what the NAACP is going to do that's new, and I've tried to, arrange kind of a soundbite answer because that's what the time demands, but my real answer is we're not going to do anything new. We're going to do the old things better. And what we have done since 1909 is to fight white supremacy. We've done it through organization, mobilization, litigation, and coalition. And we're going to do those things in the future as well. We're just going to do them harder, faster, better, more aggressively. We're going to be in your face.
Hi, Professor Bond. My name is Enmi Sung, and I'm a senior at the college. I have a twofold question, and you could proportion it however you like. One, I would like any feedback on Lonnie Guinier's cumulative voting scheme. Do you support it? Do you not? What faults, if any, do you see with it? And my second question is, it's something that I've been just struggling with like forever, and I am all for minority representation and sort of reforming voting rights and rules so that minority representation can be facilitated. But when I think of minority representation, I think of minorities, not just racial minorities, but socioeconomic minorities, maybe gender minorities, sexual orientation minorities. And I want to know what, if anything, do you see distinguishing a racial group minority versus any other minority group? And do you feel that fighting for racial minorities somehow detracts from the opportunities presented to these other groups?
The first question first, I'm very taken with Professor Grenier's ideas and have just finished rereading her book. In preparation for coming here, I thought I'd say something about it and what I had to say, but what I had to say overwhelmed Professor Grenier, so she didn't make it. And tomorrow afternoon, there's someone talking about these alternative schemes at this gathering. It strikes me that people who believe very strongly in minority representation have to do two things. Have to fight as hard as we can to preserve the present law and the opportunity for legislatures and county councils and city councils to create opportunities for minority voters to elect the candidate of their choice, while exploring alternatives, because the onward rush of the Supreme Court is menacing. And the likelihood is, although it's not predictable, the likelihood is they're going to chip further and further away at the right of racial minorities to elect candidates of their choice. So I think we have to preserve what we have and look at alternatives and promote those alternatives, because in many cases, those alternatives serve precisely to empower some of the minorities you're speaking about. There's example after example where not only do black voters have opportunities to elect candidates under proportional schemes that they did not have before, but that political minorities, Republicans in one instance, had an opportunity to elect candidates they had never had before in an overwhelmingly Democratic electorate. So these plans are very appealing. But I think for many, many people, they're foreign and alien and not the American way, whatever that is. And so it's going to take some time before they gain more acceptance. In answer to your second question, America's original sin is slavery. And in this country, for better and usually for worse, race trumps everything. Race trumps everything. Race is the marker that determines more about life chances than any other. And I'm associated with an organization that focuses almost exclusively on race. Now, we don't see being concerned about the rights of women as a detraction from that, just that our focus is on race. And we're happy and pleased to work in coalition with a large variety of other organizations that work on various other aspects of disadvantage caused by discrimination against gender, against people who are poor, all kinds of things. But our focus is race. We think race is the original sin, and we think absent race, the condition of black Americans would improve remarkably. It wouldn't automatically zip up to some equal levels with whites, but it would improve remarkably. And so we try to focus our efforts on race. Give me one example. My organization has no position on abortion. I have strong feelings about it, but my organization has no feelings about it at all. We don't see it as our issue. What we do see as our issue is that where abortion is legal, black women must have equal access to it and must have the same ability to take advantage of it as do every other woman in their circumstance. And so that's how we approach some of these issues. Some of them, whatever I may feel about them, are not our issue. And we have only so many resources, only so many people, only so much energy and strength, and we have to focus, and we focus on race.
Thank you.
Well, the particular thing that I would wish to ask about would be the relative scarcity of capital in the average black community and the lack of what I feel would be sufficient incentives for investment in business on the part of the average black, on the part of both the society in general and affluent blacks.
Well, I'm not sure if you could make a case that affluent blacks have a reluctance to make investments or investments in minority communities.
Investments in minority business regardless of where the location is.
Regardless of the location?
Right.
I don't think you can make a case for that. I know several affluent blacks, and they're investing all they can, wherever they can, trying to make a buck as quick as they can. Just following the American model, trying to live out the dream. So I don't think you can make a case that that's true for this class of people. I think it is true that there are barriers, both institutional and otherwise, to capital formation in low-income neighborhoods particularly, and in minority low-income neighborhoods even more particularly. But I think well-to-do black people are investing as fast as they can, probably reading the Wall Street Journal and say, oh my God, what has happened to my investments today? So.
My name is Jim Tipton. I was pleased when you mentioned the race in this Institute of Politics, the race that you lost, because Julian Bond illustrates one of the facts of life, which losing a political race is not the end of life. In addition, one comment related to that, I recommend John Lewis's autobiography, recently published, Walking with the Wind. Tremendously, deeply moving story of his life. I'd like to ask a question, Julian. We both have been affiliated, for a long time at least, maybe longer than you, with the Southern Regional Council. It's a group in which a few white people like myself, along with African Americans, have worked against white supremacy or any kind of supremacy for equality. What's your judgment about it today in terms of the effectiveness of that group?
I'm glad you mentioned it. Today I'm the vice president of the Southern Regional Council. It is a wonderful organization headquartered in Atlanta, 50-odd years old. It is, as you've described it, an organization of black and white Southerners working to increase opportunity, spread tolerance in the region. Has a wonderful, wonderful publication, has a website for those of you who
and has an African-American woman as its director.
As its director, and they just did a fabulous series, radio series, on the history of the Civil Rights Movement, which, and I hope Henry Hampton or no one from there is here, is superior in many ways to the Eyes on the Prize TV series, and superior in the way that good radio is superior to good TV, because good radio makes you think and makes you imagine in a way that the best TV doesn't, because it shows you what's happened. I wish I can't even remember the name of this series, and I'm in it, but it's a fabulous, fabulous series, and it's going to be released on a CD shortly. And for those of you who may be teachers, it's going to be a fabulous teaching tool. It's 26 half hours. It's been on PBS twice, on NPR twice, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful series, and the Southern Regional Council is doing well.
Wendy Johnson just wrote me that CD is going to be available in the next few weeks.
All right, look for it in your stores.
Hello, my name is Kia Coleman, and I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. And I'm of the belief that what we do now as black students who are in these elite colleges is going to affect not just the next generation, but legacies to come. And I wanted to know if you could draw on your experiences of working with SNCC and talk about how do we as students now inspire the other black students around us to become involved in the black student organizations that already exist. And that I know for a fact from talking to different students at different graduate schools have the problem of having not enough black students who want to commit their time to sort of mobilizing and figuring out different community service initiatives and things of that nature. So do you have any general words of how to inspire people around you in an era when racism is not as overt as it used to be?
It sounds like a cliche, but the easiest way, the best way I've found to inspire people is by example. By asking them to participate in this project or this organization or the other, telling them what the benefits are to the organization and the benefits they will receive from it, the personal benefits they'll receive from it, showing them what the organization does, telling them when it meets and that there's a role there for them, and then going ahead, you yourself, and doing whatever it is the organization does. Now, you know, it's romantic to look back on the time when I was in college And to imagine that every single student at Morehouse, Clark, Spelman, and Morris Brown were engaged in this, far from it. A tiny minority carried on the day-to-day work of the movement, the student movement in Atlanta. From time to time, our numbers would swell if we had a big march or a big protest. But even then, we never had everybody. I can only think of one instance in the 20th century history of the civil rights movement, and that the Montgomery Bus Boycott, where an entire community was engaged day after day after day after day after day. So we imagine that everybody was marching along, and it really was just a small group of people with everyone else standing on the sidewalk saying, if they were having to say, oh, good work, I'm with you, let me know when you get back. Can I bring you something in jail? So what you have to realize, and I don't want to quite say it in this way, but you know, Marcus Garvey was once asked, should all black people go to Africa? And Garvey said no. He said some are no good here and would be no good there. So I think you have to realize that some of these people are legitimately busy. They're busy. They're studying, or they may be going to school and working, or they have families. They have concerns that keep them, honestly keep them from participation in this organization. And some of these people are just no good and shiftless. And you don't need no good and shiftless people in your organization.
Two more questions.
As I was listening to the young man who's the student here who wants to get more involved with NAACP here on campus, it ran across my mind that NAACP is known for a number of things. There's legal challenges, there's social justice challenges, but NAACP has long been involved in economic development and economic empowerment activities through the Fair Share program. Now, I'm a lifetime member of the NAACP, a lifetime member of SCLC, and a SNCC, like your veteran. But it's always amazed me that all throughout the decades that there's been very little emphasis on what the NAACP has been doing around economic justice. And I would challenge young people here who get involved with NAACP to find out what the fair share component of the NAACP is doing. I think you'll be gladly surprised. And we do need more numbers. We need more numbers not only here at Harvard, but in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Like we need more people in Harlem. We need more people in Buttermilk Bottom. We need wherever the masses of our people at. It's not enough to come to one of these schools to get a fancy degree. The degree doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything but perhaps something to you. But it's the knowledge that you accumulate behind that and what you apply it for not only for the benefit of yourself and your families, but someone mentioned something about a legacy. You've got to put that knowledge to work. If you don't put that knowledge to work and be willing to put your life on the line for your convictions, what you believe in, then you've just wasted your time and you result in being defined as what Mr. Bond just said, one of them shiftless, lazy folks, because you wasted your time for nothing and a lot of other people's time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. For those of you who don't know, Buttermilk Bottom is in Atlanta. The gentleman in the back of the
hi.
the back seat of the room there.
A quick perusal of current census and demographic figures for the nation show that America is changing astronomically demographically. It's becoming a very complex, multiracial nation with a large growing Asian population and also a Latino population that is growing dramatically. The Latino community doesn't have an organization with the same sort of history, prestige, and influence as the NAACP, but I'm interested in hearing as to seeing that so many of the same issues are important to both Latinos and blacks in this nation, I'm interested in hearing as to how you see black-Latino relations, particularly NAACP's relations with the Latino community over the next 30 or so years.
On Monday morning, when I hold a press conference with Raul Yazagiri, head of La Raza Unida, I'm going to tell him that you said that his organization doesn't have the history and the clout of my organization.
Please don't.
And then I'm going to go over to the Supreme Court, where NAACP CEO Kwesi Mfume has assembled 100 organizations, most of them African American, but Asian American, Hispanic American, the whole broad spectrum, to protest against the court's habitual refusal to hire minority clerks. Almost no black clerks, almost no Hispanic clerks. I mean, it's just a disgraceful record of the people who we suppose believe in justice and fairness above all other Americans. So the NAACP has long had a history of cooperation and collaboration with other organizations and peoples who, even if they do not have our history, share our concerns. By 2020, blacks and Hispanics together will be 40% of the population of this country. It just makes common sense as well as ordinary decency for us to be in coalition with each other, to work together, because our interests so often coincide. It just makes good sense for us to do that, and we've done it in the past, and we're going to do it in the future. Thank you.
Let's give Julian Bond a big round of applause. And again, on behalf of the Institute of Politics, Julian, we really do, and certainly the students who planned and coordinated this entire conference, we thank you. And remember, this is just the beginning. It's an exciting beginning, but we will be holding court tomorrow, beginning at 10 o'clock in the morning. We encourage you to come and participate. Those of you who have not registered, please arrive early so you can register. And we're going to have some continued discussions of this very, very important subject. Some of the speakers tomorrow will include Kennedy School Professor Keith Reeves, Jim Sleeper, Bob Ritchie, and myself and others. And we're going to have a wonderful conference with your participation. Thanks again.
She's really gonna kill me.